In 1930, the doors of Binga State Bank did not open. Depositors who arrived at 35th and State Streets that morning found the building closed. Their savings were frozen inside an institution that had only months earlier held approximately $1.5 million in deposits and stood as the most visible symbol of black financial power on Chicago's South Side. The man who had built that institution, Jesse Binga, was under investigation. Within 3 years, he would be in prison. Chicago's black elite had spent 2 decades constructing a parallel financial system. Banks, insurance companies, a newspaper with national circulation, a hospital, an industrial empire, a real estate network. They had done this inside a city that had systematically excluded them from every white-controlled institution, and they had done it with enough scale and sophistication that outside observers had coined a phrase for what they built: the Black Metropolis. So how did it collapse so quickly? The answer is not the stock market crash. The answer is not simple mismanagement. The answer is a set of structural vulnerabilities that were built into the system from its foundation, made invisible by 2 decades of growth, and exposed all at once when the economic conditions of the 1930s removed the protections that had kept those vulnerabilities hidden. To understand the collapse, you have to understand what was built. And to understand what was built, you have to go back to the moment when the South Side was still mostly empty prairie, and a generation of black Americans was about to move into it. The Great Migration began accelerating around 1915. Black Southerners left Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana by the hundreds of thousands, pulled north by industrial wages in Chicago's meat-packing plants, steel mills, and rail yards, and pushed from the South by the daily violence and legal architecture of Jim Crow. Chicago's black population roughly tripled between 1910 and 1920. By 1930, it had grown to more than 230,000 people, the vast majority compressed into a narrow corridor on the South Side, bounded by restrictive covenants that made it illegal for white property owners to sell or rent to black buyers or tenants anywhere outside that zone. The covenants were not suggestions. They were legally enforceable contract terms, embedded in property deeds across the North Side, the West Side, and the suburbs, and backed by the Chicago Real Estate Board, which treated their maintenance as a professional obligation. Black Chicagoans who attempted to move beyond the permitted corridor faced harassment, property damage, and physical attack. The Chicago race riot of 1919, triggered by the drowning of a black teenager who had drifted across an invisible boundary at a segregated Lake Michigan beach, left 38 dead and more than 500 injured over 5 days of violence. The message of the riot, delivered in the language available to mobs, was geographic. The boundaries of Black Chicago would be enforced. Segregation, operating on a large and rapidly growing urban population, did something economically paradoxical. By forcing black residents of every income level into the same corridor, it created a captive market of extraordinary density. A black physician could not establish a practice on the North Side. He practiced in Bronzeville, where his patients were. A black insurance agent could not work for the major white-owned firms. He sold policies for black-owned companies to black policyholders on the South Side. A black depositor seeking equitable treatment at a loop bank would find in the ordinary course of business that his presence was not particularly welcome. He deposited at a South Side institution. Segregation forced them into one corridor. That concentration made them powerful. Jesse Binga had seen this coming before most people had processed it. He arrived in Chicago in the 1890s and began purchasing South Side real estate at a time when the Great Migration had not yet transformed the corridor into one of the most densely populated black urban districts in the country. When the migration accelerated, Binga already held properties in exactly the locations where demand was concentrating, and he converted those holdings into capital. In 1908, he opened Binga State Bank. The institution grew through the 1910s and into the 20s, its deposit base expanding alongside the population of the community it served, until its building at 35th and State Streets had become something the South Side treated as a landmark rather than merely a business address. Anthony Overton had built a different empire from a different starting point. His Overton Hygienic Manufacturing Company, which he moved to Chicago from Kansas in 1911, produced cosmetics and personal care products marketed to black consumers who were ignored or poorly served by the mainstream industry. The business expanded to more than 60 products distributed nationally, and Overton used the profits to diversify. He established Victory Life Insurance Company and the Douglas National Bank, which by the 1920s was one of the largest black-owned banks in the country by deposit volume. In 1923, he completed a building at 36th and State Streets that housed all of his enterprises under one roof and received a model building designation from the city of Chicago, the first such designation given to a black-owned commercial structure. He also published the Chicago Bee, a newspaper that provided South Side readers with a second voice alongside the dominant one. That dominant voice belonged to Robert Abbott. Abbott had founded the Chicago Defender in 1905 with 25 cents and built it by the 1920s into the most widely circulated black newspaper in the country. The Defender's reach extended far beyond Chicago through a distribution network built on the Pullman porters who traveled the rail lines connecting the city to every major southern corridor. Porters carried bundles of the paper on their routes and distributed them in communities that had no other access to national black journalism. In small southern towns where the local white press covered black residents only in the context of crime, the Defender arrived describing wage rates in northern factories and documenting the legal conditions of southern life with a directness those papers could not match. Abbott used that platform deliberately to accelerate the Great Migration, understanding that a larger black Chicago would be a stronger base for his paper and for the political influence he was accumulating. Provident Hospital, founded in 1891, completed the institutional picture. It was the first black-owned hospital in the country, established because black physicians trained at northern universities could not admit patients at white hospitals, and black patients could not expect equitable care at those institutions. By the 1920s, Provident was a functioning hospital with a nursing school, a staff of trained physicians, and a patient base drawn from the entire South Side. Together, the bank, the insurance company, the manufacturing company, the newspaper, and the hospital formed something with real institutional weight. This was not survival. This was a parallel financial system with its own press, its own capital, its own medical infrastructure, and its own professional class generating and recirculating wealth within a defined geography. But that power depended on systems they did not control. And within those systems, three structural vulnerabilities had been accumulating since the moment the first institution opened its doors. The first was geographic deposit concentration. Binga State Bank's deposit base came almost entirely from the South Side corridor. Every dollar on deposit represented a family or business operating within a few miles of the bank's front door. This meant that when the South Side's economy contracted, the bank's entire liability base contracted simultaneously. A loop bank holding deposits from manufacturers in the north, professionals in Lincoln Park, and merchants in Hyde Park could absorb the distress of one sector with the stability of others. Binga had no such diversification. His institution's health was coextensive with the economic health of one community. The second vulnerability was correspondent banking access. The Federal Reserve System, created in 1913, provided member banks with a lender of last resort that could supply liquidity during a bank run or a temporary funding gap. In principle, black-owned banks could join on the same terms as anyone else. In practice, access to Federal Reserve facilities flowed through correspondent relationships with larger banks. And those relationships were organized along lines of professional association and mutual trust that had never included black-owned institutions on equal footing. When Binga needed emergency liquidity, the infrastructure that might have provided it was not available to him in the way it was available to his white counterparts across town. The third vulnerability was the real estate collateral underpinning the bank's loan portfolio. Southside property values had been elevated by the same segregation that made the district economically dense. Demand was high because the supply of housing available to Black Chicagoans was artificially constrained by the covenants. But a market inflated by artificial demand constraints is not governed by the same dynamics as an open market. It is governed by the size and economic condition of the captive population. If that population's purchasing power fell, so did the values of the properties securing the bank's loans, and so did the bank's ability to liquidate collateral to meet depositor demands. The crash did not hit them directly. What followed did. When the stock market collapsed in October of 1929 and the Depression deepened through 1930, white-owned banks that had maintained correspondent relationships with black institutions began withdrawing them. This was not announced publicly. It did not require a policy change or a board resolution. Banks simply declined to renew credit facilities and correspondent agreements that were coming up for review. Simultaneously, Bronzeville's industrial workers, who were among the first laid off as Chicago's manufacturing sector cut payrolls, began drawing on their savings. Black domestic workers lost positions as white households reduced spending. The deposit outflow that began as a trickle became a sustained drain that the bank's liquidity position could not absorb. Binga State Bank closed in 1930. The failure had been preceded by months of negotiations with state banking regulators, attempts to find investors, and efforts to restructure the institution's finances in ways that might allow it to continue. When those efforts failed, thousands of depositors discovered that the savings they had trusted to the institution were gone. The bank's closure was not a single event, but the final outcome of a process that had made the closure inevitable months before it happened. Jesse Binga was charged with embezzlement and misapplication of bank funds. The prosecution argued that he had made decisions with depositor money that crossed the line from poor judgment into criminal conduct. His defenders argued that the charges reflected the political demand for an individual to bear personal responsibility for what was in fact a systemic failure, and that comparable decisions made by a white banker at a white institution would have been handled differently. The courts found him guilty. In 1933, Binga was convicted and sentenced to prison. He served time before a parole that left him financially destroyed and without the institutional standing that had defined his adult life. He died in 1950 in the city he had once helped finance without recovering either. The man who once financed Bronzeville could not save his own institution, and the institutions that survived the Depression did so in diminished form. Overton's Douglas National Bank did not survive the decade. Victory Life contracted. The Chicago Bee continued publishing until 1947 before ceasing. Robert Abbott died in 1940. The Depression had not destroyed Bronzeville entirely, but it had removed the financial infrastructure that had given the black metropolis its claim to being something more than a concentrated residential district. What remained was a community without most of the capital-controlling institutions that had distinguished it. The banks collapsed in the 1930s. The neighborhood was dismantled in the 1950s and 60s. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized funding for the interstate system and gave federal planners the resources to route highways through American cities. The decisions about where those highways would run were made by engineers and transportation officials who applied technical criteria to routing questions in ways that consistently directed construction through neighborhoods with the least political capacity to resist. On Chicago's South Side, highway construction removed housing stock, severed neighborhood connections, and disrupted the street-level commercial life that had survived the Depression. The physical continuity of Bronzeville, the ability to walk from a residential block to a commercial corridor to a professional office without crossing an infrastructure barrier, was broken by concrete and steel running through districts that had no effective representation in the political process that decided their fate. Urban renewal under the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954 operated through a separate mechanism toward a similar outcome. The Homeowners Loan Corporation had classified Southside neighborhoods in the lowest investment grade on its residential security maps in the 1930s. Those classifications, which explicitly included racial composition among their criteria, provided the framework that urban renewal administrators used to designate areas as blighted. Blighted designation triggered clearance funding. Clearance removed the buildings. The buildings that were removed included housing that had been occupied by families, storefronts that had housed businesses, and structures that carried the institutional memory of what Bronzeville had been. Public housing towers were constructed to replace the cleared residential areas, concentrating poverty in vertical structures disconnected from the street-level commercial activity that had defined the neighborhood's economic character. As the legal architecture of residential segregation was challenged and partially dismantled through the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, the black professionals and business owners who had been anchored in Bronzeville by the restrictive covenants found that they now had options. The doctors who had been required to practice on the South Side could establish offices in other parts of the city. The attorneys, the accountants, the business owners with the financial means to relocate found themselves able to move to previously restricted neighborhoods. The captive market dynamic that had made Bronzeville's commercial concentration possible began to dissolve as its underlying cause was removed. The community that had been built on exclusion found that partial inclusion was its own kind of dismantling. What was lost in Chicago's South Side across those 4 decades was not reducible to money, though the money was substantial. Independent capital was lost, meaning resources controlled by black institutions rather than administered through white-controlled financial systems. Institutional knowledge accumulated across decades of running banks and insurance companies and media organizations was dispersed when those institutions failed or contracted. Political leverage that had derived from the economic concentration of the black metropolis evaporated as that concentration was reduced. Real estate ownership in a city whose property values would appreciate substantially across the second half of the 20th century passed from black hands during the Depression and urban renewal years and did not return at comparable scale. And the capacity to transmit all of these things across generations, to pass institutional position, property, and capital to children who could build on them rather than starting from the beginning, was broken at precisely the moment when the post-war economy was generating the wealth that compounded into the fortunes of the following generation. Chicago's black elite were weakened by isolation from the capital markets that sustained comparable white institutions, collapsed by a panic they could not absorb, and dismantled by a city redesigned without them in mind.